All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Um, so as I'm kind of doing this thinking through um, negative pragmatism, obviously it involves thinking through lack. Um, but I found that thinking through hope as a concept is quite helpful for me. I think mainly because pragmatism, I think, plays off of a kind of hope, meaning like um, the only hope that is possible is the practical kind of hope. Um, what one is able to do, what one can apply in a given situation, and of course, there's many forms of pragmatism. So that's also what makes the conversation hard. And I think when I advocate for negative pragmatism, what do we do with our lack? It's not dismissing, and I think this is the most important point. It's not dismissing what I would call pragmatism itself, or you could say, by virtue of me saying negative pragmatism, there is positive pragmatism, and I think, I think there is a place for that pragmatism as such. Um, People that have really influenced my thought on what I would call like the negative, which is very abstract and highly debatable. And it's kind of a abstract universal to say negative. Um, Someone that's been very pivotal for me thinking through the negative has been Julie Resch and her book on psychoanalysis. I think it's called like The Living Dead. um, and it's basically her fundamental critique about positive psychology, um, and its emphasis on optimism. Um, and so Julie Resch has always been very pivotal to my thinking on the negative, right? Because her criticism is that this type of positive psychology seems to dismiss or discredit um, what we would call a kind of a certain form of pessimism for Julie Resch. And even the certain form of pessimism that is perhaps what most people would be affiliated with, um, for Julie, it's too positive, meaning that the pessimism that we typically know of has a project of its own, meaning that everybody else should fundamentally be pessimistic, um, or tries to basically conform everybody to a pessimism. And for Julie, that's very positive. That's a very positive form of pessimism. Um, so Julie is almost stripping away the normative elements that can kind of come in, or the prescriptive elements that can come in with a positive or optimistic psychology, this notion of cure, healing. And then she's also stripping away the kind of notions of the other side of pessimism, where it tends also to be positive, which is this idea of trying to make everybody else pessimistic too, with them. My favorite chapter of Julie's book is actually towards the end, because I think towards the end of her book, she actually grapples with, to some extent, what I would say a negative pragmatism would be like. Um, and one of my favorite lines from her book in that, and there's many favorite lines, but one of my favorite lines from her book towards the end is her idea of um, guarding the negative, or making the negative sacred. Now, I found that really interesting use of language there, mainly because Julie's not religious, but you could say she kind of uses a kind of religious sentiment, you could say, right? This notion of the sacred, the negative is sacred, and guarding it, um, letting it remain negative. And I think that's the fundamentally hardest part about, negative can be anything we consider as like something we avoid or something we just lack and don't want to deal with, whether it be our inefficiencies, our failures, you know. But anyways, this talk is also about hope. Um, and I was thinking more about this, and I found it fascinating that hope itself is generally a very positive thing to have. Like we must hope for something. um, yeah, we must hope for something, and with this hope, we thrive, and so on. But what's funny about hope as a concept is that hope is actually predicated on lack. You need lack in order to have hope. And if hope is as powerful as we claim it to be, um, I want to look at the resources of hope, and basically notice how hope is lack is necessary for hope to exist. And this is where I think my reading of Julie Resch, I think, can be helpful, because um, it means that we have to guard the lack to have hope. Um, and I think also I want to strip hope of its um, positive connotation, and I want to present a sort of negative hope, but not a negative hope in the sense of like perhaps a pessimistic one where it's like, oh, well, I hope everybody will see that nobody can change the world or something like that. That would be a very pessimistic and yet positive project. That's what Julie Resch would point out. So you can see it's really hard to talk about the negative without it succumbing to a kind of positive connotation. But I think what could be useful is a hope without content, um, a hope that really lacks. Um, and I think a hope that really lacks is a hope without content. And a hope without content to me is a pure hope, is a hope of its most purest, because it's stripping itself of its content. And you could say, is it possible to have a hope without content? That's another question that we would have to tackle and think about. Is it possible to have hope without content? Or can we just say that the content is necessary, but also we know fundamentally it's what's covering up over the lack? So we know that the pure hope itself is there. Um, and so I'm trying to balance a certain notion of hope, which is this. Julie Resch is really pivotal, I have to say, in thinking this negative pragmatism, because Julie Resch herself practices a certain form of psychoanalysis that is negative, in the sense that she's not interested in healing or curing or anything like that. But she's also not interested in turning a project into a positive one, meaning like you should be negative too, and you should convert as such. It's I would say Julie Resch's idea is more remaining in the failure or abiding in the failure of things, and also knowing that they're going to fail anyways. So it's more of her notion, I could say, even though she doesn't use negative pragmatism, I do think she has a concept of negative pragmatism, which is more relational, in my opinion. It's more relational, has more to do with human beings than themselves, than the activities and projects that human beings attempt to do. But this hope, I want to focus on hope, a kind of pure hope without content. A pure hope without content. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And as I said before, it must be paradoxical because I think it might be impossible to not have a hope without content. Um, but I think we could possibly see past that and see that a hope without content, it's always going to be hope with content, but it's the hope itself predicated on lack that gives its, you could say, forceful power. Um, and in that sense, I do think hope is actually a very negative concept in that sense because it's predicated on lack. Um, Whereas hope is always talked about in a very positive sense. Yes, we must have hope to change the world, to cure, to and so on. I think that's all necessary, but I think what's never included in the conversation is the fact that hope is predicated on this lack, and that hope gets its force precisely because of its lack. If you did not have lack, you would not have hope. Um, but here's the other thing. Here's the other part of this conversation that I want to think about is what do we do when our hope fails? And this is why I say we have to think about a pure hope because a hope that fails, what's being discussed when we talk about a hope that fails is we're talking about a hope with a particular content. Meaning, for example, um, if you hope to become a doctor one day and then suddenly it doesn't come true, right? Your hope has faded away, right? But actually, what I want to present is how hope itself always lacks a sort of epistemological character, meaning that you cannot possibly know, in some sense, where your hope is going or what that hope is in itself, right? Because the subject is interjecting himself in the content of that hope as if they know. And so I'm really I'm trying to deal with this twofold lack where the subject does not know and yet the subject must hope. And so this is where I am really grappling with a kind of subject that how can you move in the world? How can you continue to do things? Have hope and then have hope without content. And this would be a kind of pure hope. And this is what I kind of gathered actually from Julie Resch's work, where a pure hope, or what I would call a negative hope, um, is something that you don't know what it necessarily is. You can't have particular aims for it because it's very unclear what will happen. And basically, failure would be the perpetual reminder of the fact that your hope virtually has no content. And yet it must have content. That's the sort of paradox I keep finding myself in, because I imagine myself having an empty hope, which that doesn't make any sense. Um, I don't think we can have empty hopes. I think there's a pure hope that resides underneath the content of hope that we give it. But to me, again, I think the content of that hope is always the interjection, the sort of influence of what the picture thinking of what the subject imagines, right? Oh, I hope one day I'll have a wife, and so on. But I do think there's a pure hope underneath that layer. Um, and it also makes me imagine that the whole, and I think Daniel Garner and has gone through, OG Rose has gone through quite a few. We've discussed this before, and we've also discussed this with a group of people before. There's the whole WH, and then there's the whole just H. Um, but yeah, it's interesting in some sense that the whole itself, WH whole, um, is lacking itself, right? Um, and that's where the fascination comes from. That the whole itself, H whole, um, is itself whole, WHOLE. um, and I think hope A pure concept of hope predicated on lack is something like that. Um, now the other thing that I wanted to get into is the pragmatism. This is where my notion of negative pragmatism comes in, which I'm still trying to think through. But I think hope is a good conversation starter to talk about it, because I think when I was reading Julie Resch, or when I read her more carefully, um, it's this idea of it's this idea of knowing that I lack the epistemological fullness to answer to whatever I want to change. And so that means failure will always be imminent in that sense. Failure will always be present in some fashion. Um, but here's the part that we're balancing is, do we stop doing what we're doing because we can't, right? Do we stop doing? And this is where I'm trying to make a subtle shift in with Julie away, where we still do things, but with a kind of negative hope, right? Like, I have some vision or whatever of the world, of what I envision as a good change. But I understand that it's fundamentally a pure hope, meaning it's a hope without content, meaning whatever I'm hoping for, its possibility is the fact that it's going to be a failure. And yet I still do so anyways. I still attempt to make that change until the content of that hope fails. And when then the content of that hope fails, I discover what I would call the pure hope, which is within that failure itself. And then we decide to continue to do something again. And I think this is a very interesting kind of concept, because it's combining two paradoxical, you could say, two contradictory notions of a kind of pessimism that's pragmatic, but also not really pessimism anymore. It's just more like understanding, because I don't think you have to be pessimistic. I think it's more about understanding a kind of the fact that failure is imminent. Failure will come. Now the question is, what do you do? And what I think my pragmatism form of this is, well, you continue to do so anyways, until the content of that hope sheds itself into a pure hope, and then you rebuild up a new vision, and you again strive again. And it would seem, in some sense, it almost is almost playing on this concept of like, well, it seems really pointless to be doing this. Um, that depends. um, because I think succumbing to a kind of idea of it's pointless um, already has a kind of positive project of its own, meaning we shouldn't do anything because it's pointless. Um, and so it becomes a kind of implicit hope of saying that I hope we just realize that it's all pointless, and that we just don't do anything anyways, right? No matter what we do, it's pointless. Um, that turns itself into, ironically, a positive project. And this is why I always like bringing in Emile Cioran, because Emile Cioran, he's also very pessimistic, nihilistic, but his notion of indifference is interesting, because in some sense, Emile Cioran is about, we don't get negative enough to get to the other end, which is a kind of his notion of indifference, meaning that you wouldn't just settle on, well, it's pointless anyways, and everybody should realize how pointless it is. His notion of indifference is, well, if I think it's pointless, then it doesn't really matter also what I think. Like, I wouldn't be able to convince other people that it's pointless anyways. I couldn't even stop people from believing it's pointless. So in that sense, there's a kind of indifference there, but I always think it's a little bit, it's a much different notion of indifference than the indifference that we typically think of, which is kind of like emotionally detached. Um, But anyways, my misreading of Emil Sharon would be, but I don't think it's necessarily too bad of a misreading, would be to say that his notion of indifference is something that has already gone through the negative itself, right? Through the failure, through the notions of positivity and everything. And ironically, I think there's room to encounter that pure hope of what I'm talking about. But anyways, yeah, so that's kind of like my ideas on negative pragmatism in connection to hope. And I think that kind of helps me think more about how would you deal with a kind of, how would you function off of negative pragmatism, and what would that mean, and what would that look like? And I think talking about hope uh, kind of starts the conversation of how would that look like, um, and so on. But anyways, thank you guys for listening. All right, take care. Bye.